Welcome to episode 85 of the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show brought to you by the Change Your POV podcast network. We're approaching the new year, and I wanted to give you a heads up of a big change coming. The Headspace and Timing podcast, hosted by the Change Your POV podcast network, will be moving to an independent show on 1 January 2019. You'll still be able to find it at veteranmentalhealth.com, but you'll be able to subscribe to this show specifically in your podcast player of choice. A huge amount of respect and appreciation for the guys at the Change Your POV podcast network and their support over the last 18 months, as well as their dedication to building the most comprehensive veteran podcast network. Today's episode is an interview with Dr. Shira Maguen, one of the leading national experts on the concept of moral injury. Dr. Maguen and I talk about the history and development of moral injury and some brief interventions to help with it.
Part of this is us stepping back and saying, what can we do to create an environment to help veterans heal so that it broadens the scope of what's possible and broadens the scope of what can be done. So we're thinking about not only traditional ways of healing that we've conceptualized in mental health, but really broadening that to a societal level so that there can be multiple things that we do as a society to help veterans heal too.
Welcome to the Change Your POV podcast network. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes about veteran mental health. My name's Dwayne France, and I'm a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After I retired from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set right, however, it was just a huge useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing isn't set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support veterans, service members, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast once again, and as always, we really appreciate you taking the time to listen to learn more about veteran mental health. I personally feel as though today's show is a heck of a treat. We have one of the leading national experts on the concept of moral injury, Dr. Shira Maguen, on the show to talk about what moral injury is, how it's similar to PTSD, how it's different from PTSD. As you know, that both on the Headspace and Timing blog and also on the podcast here, we have talked a little bit about moral injury. We actually had Dr. Joseph Currier talking about evaluating moral injury back in episode 33, and it's a concept that both I recognize from my service, but also in my work as a clinical mental health counselor. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion today. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Shira Maguen. Shira, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here today.
No, I know that in your busy schedule and you wear many, many different hats, so to be able to take the time out, my goal is really to take what we know as clinical mental health counselors and get it out to the individuals that need it, and I just can't thank you enough for the ability to come on the show and kind of talk about it. So before we get into moral injury, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and sort of your background.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I've been working in the VA system since 2001. So I was first at the Boston VA and moved to the San Francisco VA in 2005 and have been here ever since. And it's really just been an absolute pleasure for me to do this work. I've been so honored and humbled to do this work. And really the whole research area of moral injury grew out of my own clinical work. So I wear several hats in my day-to-day life. I'm a clinician and work directly here at the VA with patients who are coming in after their deployments, and also patients who have been coming for quite some time. And so I wear a clinical hat. I also do research, and one of my main areas of focus is moral injury and the impact of killing in war, as well as PTSD more generally. I also wear a hat, a training hat, as working here at UCSF and the VA. The UCSF piece is the teaching hospital here, and so I also teach evidence-based psychotherapies for PTSD as well, and also supervise fellows as well as interns and externs who work here as well. And so that balance really allows me to see things from several different perspectives, and that's been really helpful for me with this topic. And so all of the research that I do for me personally really grows out of my own clinical experiences. And so it was really veterans' own voices and veterans' own experience that brought me to looking into this and wanting to fill a gap that I was just seeing very early on in my work around this topic that really drew me in to keep asking questions and doing the work that I'm doing today. So I think that that's maybe a little bit of helpful information about where I'm coming from and how I've reached sort of some of the research topics that I have. That I'll also say that something that's been really critical for me in this work is starting from the ground up and really doing a mixed methods type of research. So not only collecting surveys and doing data analysis that way, but really having focus groups and talking to veterans very directly about their experiences with this topic has been critical for me. And so for me, those two things are very important, that those things go hand in hand, not only doing traditional research with big databases, but also having that clinical contact as well as focus groups and other things that can really, we can look at this topic from many different ways and bring together lots of information to give us the best understanding, since moral injury is quite a complex topic. So hopefully that's a little bit about my background and where I'm coming from.
No, that's great. It's interesting to hear that having started clinically in 2001, so obviously, right there, of course, at the beginning of 9/11, but we really didn't start seeing the mental health impact of the current wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, until at least 2004. But definitely, as far as I understand, closer to 2006 or 2007. And so I'm interested to hear, how things shifted, because you sort of bridged the gap maybe before. I imagine at that time it was a lot of Vietnam veterans as well as maybe perhaps some Gulf War and Cold War veterans, and then the transition to post 9/11 veterans.
That's right. Yes. And so it was interesting. So I was actually had started working at the VA right before 9/11 happened. And so it really was just year after year, a very different evolving situation with the wars that were going on. And as more and more people were coming in down the line, it really did change, I think, the thinking and our understanding of how we needed to care for people. And so in the earlier days in 2001, it was definitely who I was seeing was more the Vietnam era. And that quickly shifted, actually pretty quickly. I was at the Boston VA up until 2005 about. And it was really by the end of that period, we were seeing a lot of the veterans who were just coming back. And who really were those veterans who were willing and able to reach out for help and get mental health care. And so it was right after they had gotten back, and so the veterans that were coming in at that point were the experiences were fairly new for them, and so it was And a lot of the veterans that we're seeing now, it's really mixed in terms of those that are coming in many years later to those who are coming in sometimes even a decade later. And so it's the landscape is very different than it was back then. But I think really addressing all of those times after a veteran's deployment are really important. And I like to think about that developmentally as well. So what does someone need right after they get back? What do they need a few years later? And what do they need a few years after that if they're seeking mental health care for the first time? And I think it also, there's the issue of natural recovery. And I think that people sometimes, after they get back, just need that time to reconnect with families, reconnect with communities. And so we're seeing people at all different time points. I think, at least I have seen people at all different time points since I've been involved here at the VA with the mental health care system.
No, I think that the idea of looking at it developmentally, the needs that one has immediately after returning from deployment is going to be different than the needs one's going to have, 15 years after deployment. We know that the Vietnam veterans, number one, PTSD wasn't a diagnosis until 11 years or so after the height of the Vietnam War, and then veterans really didn't start seeking the treatment until the mid-'80s. The Vietnam Wall came up, and President Reagan really kind of came out in support and trying to put sort of the specter of Vietnam behind us. And then the current veterans, and I'm seeing this in my clinical work too, are now coming in sooner than the 15 years, say maybe 5 or 8 years. But then I think the concept of moral injury has also developed over time. I know that the first time that I first considered or even heard the term moral injury was a book by David Phillips called Lethal Warriors. That was actually about my brigade. I was in Iraq with that brigade, and when we came back from deployment, that in many ways I say the city was almost literally on fire. I think 10 soldiers were responsible for 16 literal murders. 8 out of 10 or something like that was out of one battalion, and I started seeing that. And the concept of moral injury was first broached in the book, which then led me to Dr. Jonathan Shea, who first started working with this in the mid 80s or in the 80s with his book Achilles in Vietnam. But it wasn't really until 2009 with you and Dr. Litz and your colleagues really having some type of operational definition of moral injury. So as far as I understand, that's what the timeline is. That fairly accurate?
Yes, that was beautifully said. Absolutely. And I think, Jonathan Shea was really beginning to grapple with some of these issues, when he was caring for the Vietnam generation, also at the Boston VA. And I think that it sort of blossomed, and now the nice thing is we're able to approach it. The definition has been expanded a little bit, so we're really able to see it from many different perspectives, and both acknowledge the issues around leadership that can sometimes happen, as well as the issues with killing in war and some of the other things that people experience that could potentially lead to moral injury. So I think the evolution has been really important, and it's still, as much progress as we've made, I think that this concept is in its infancy of really the research and the clinical work is blossoming, but we're really at the start of this. And so I think we have a long way to go to understand it in greater depth. And I think the key here is that even things, you probably talked to Joe Currier about this as well, even when we think about measurement, just in the last few years, how we've thought about measurement of moral injury has really changed. And with all the new research that's coming out, we're becoming more and more refined about how we understand moral injury and the kind of information that we have, both from clinical work and studies. And so I think that's really important. It's an evolving definition. And with people like you who are doing clinical work and people who are doing research, we're sort of working together to understand this and how we can sort of define it, but also how we best support our veterans in intervening. So I hope that's something we can also cover today, because I think the intervention pieces, both the measurement piece and the intervention piece, really have to go hand in hand. So.
Yeah, certainly. I think the just defining the shape of the problem doesn't make the problem go away. So we do have to, now that we have this pot of stew here, how do we deal with it? And I agree. Dr. Currier and I did talk about that in his way of measuring how moral injury is expressed versus some of the earlier ways of just sort of whether it's there or not. So it's sort of, defining it by how it is. And we're actually using, after I started work with Dr. Currier, I now work with justice-involved veterans at my local veterans court, of which the morality or just the idea of right and wrong, and I'm not talking about morals here in the morality sense, but just what we believe, veterans believe right and wrong in the world. And we've actually started using Dr. Currier's the expression of moral injury survey to be able to help inform some of the treatment. So it's been very beneficial in their practical applications. I'm curious to hear, though.
I love that.
And it has been very beneficial. And a lot of times when I work with veterans, they're told it's all PTSD, right? We're told that everything is PTSD. And so perhaps you personally or even clinically, do you see moral injury as a subset of post-traumatic stress, or is it a separate construct?
That's a great question. And I think the way that I really think about it is that it's almost like a Venn diagram, right? There's a piece that's shared, and there are pieces of each that are really unique. And so I think that with moral injury, and so maybe sort of the best thing for me to do, because, one of the pieces of moral injury that I focus most on in my own work is the impact of killing in war. And so, one of the things that we know is that for people who do kill in war, not everyone develops moral injury, but for those people who do, we really want, and for those people who continue to be distressed, we want to have an intervention that really helps. And so the way that I really think about it in terms of the Venn diagram, just using killing as one example, is that with moral injury, I think that there can be an activation, and there can really be the idea that you have crossed a line, and there's questions about morality and moral activation that happen that aren't necessarily a piece of what we traditionally talk about with PTSD. So when we think of PTSD, there can be and the models of treatment in PTSD are really based on originally fear-based models, as you know, because of your own work. And so a lot of the treatments that have been developed, the evidence-based psychotherapies, are really based on fear-based models. And now with DSM-5, that definition is really expanded to include other emotional experiences. But I think if you really dig deep into moral injury, things like guilt and shame are just really part of the clinical presentation, where they may or may not be part of the PTSD clinical presentation. And I think that with PTSD, whereas the person is a recipient often, not in all cases, but more commonly, there's an ambush, or there's the person's life has been threatened with a lot of moral injury. The person plays a very active role in the trauma. And so it makes it quite different in terms of the reactions. And so, and again, with moral injury, there's a line that someone feels like they have crossed, and that really sets the stage for the thoughts that come up, and the guilt and the shame and the withdrawal. There's also, with moral injury, a very important failure to forgive, or to, an issue with self-forgiveness in particular, because of what happened oftentimes. And I think that is actually a critical piece of how I tend to identify moral injury, that there's the guilt and the shame, and the self-forgiveness and a demoralization that's profound that happens. And oftentimes when I have patients that I come in and who are expressing suicidality or suicidal ideation, if I work backwards, what I will find is that it's connected to something about a line that they crossed, where they feel like they went against their morals or values and are really suffering because of that. And so I think the actual traumas can be quite different, and then the manifestation of how symptoms are expressed can also be very different, with moral injury having a much higher focus on sort of guilt, shame, demoralization, and a failure to self-forgive. So I think those are kind of some of the key things that I look for. And again, then there's kind of the overlapping piece of that Venn diagram, right, which is some of the ways in which PTSD and moral injury have some shared symptoms. And so things like, hypervigilance can happen in both. And some of the kind of more traditional PTSD symptoms with moral injury, you can certainly have re-experiencing or intrusions. And so there's definitely can be shared symptoms, but I will also say that I've seen more people with moral injury who have more typical symptoms of depression and really not coming in with PTSD. So I think that's another area that we really have to a lot more to learn about is what travels with moral injury. And I've certainly seen not only depression but also substance use that happens with moral injury. And so I don't think that it has to be PTSD that goes hand in hand with moral injuries. And in many cases it is, but I've also seen cases where it really is depression, or that there's moral injury without a mental health issue. And so it's really the moral injury is primary, and that's really what the person is struggling with. So I think if we keep an open mind, I think we will recognize that there's a lot of combinations and permutations of what we call moral injury.
Certainly. I mean, and it's definitely not binary. Either it is PTSD or moral injury, but there are a lot more aspects to the equation. The idea of, I have seen veterans who may or may not have necessarily been felt guilty about what they did as they did it, but when it comes to the context of their family, they can't explain to their family what they did. They feel as though their family would judge them, or they've changed way towards they can't tell their children what they did, they can't tell their wife what they did, especially even as you were talking about killing in combat. I've talked to some spouses, to be honest, mine included, who said, I don't want to know. And that just relationships can complicate how we address what happened in combat.
It is such an important point, because I think that what we found when we talk to veterans about this topic is that the stigma and the secrecy are profound aspects of moral injury. And so there's this idea that these are things that you don't talk about, and not even with providers, that this is something that you have to take to your grave with you, so to speak. And I think that it really impacts people over time, because there's this notion that what was done needs to kind of stay with the individual, and I think that can really cause in many cases a lot of long-term difficulties down the line for people who are distressed. And you're absolutely right that people feel like they can't talk to their families, and even worse, if their families found out somehow, then there would be ramifications for that in terms of their relationships. I think it gets even more complicated. But so, for example, when people were in war and had the experience where I worked with people who had to kill women or children and really have suffered tremendously, and then they go back to their own families, and as a daily reminder, their own children, they're worried about their own children are a trigger for them about what happened, and then they're also then worried about something happening to their own children or their own families because of what they've done. And so living in that situation daily can really cause a long-term effects if people aren't able to share in some way with someone who is trusted. And and I think the other important point is that doesn't always have to be a mental health clinician. It can be someone from the person's spiritual community. It can be a trusted other that's a friend or someone who they served with, or there are a lot of possibilities for that, with mental health clearly being one of the options. But I think that it's the carrying that on a day-to-day basis can just really cause a lot of issues down the line for people who are feeling like they want to talk about it but can't. And it's really interesting because one of the questions that I often get is I'll be contacted by people who work with end-of-life issues and veterans, and I think this issue comes up a lot at end of life for people who have kept it a secret and then just feel like they have to sort of talk about it when they get closer to death, when they're in hospice, etc. So there's so many ways in which I think moral injury can impact people. And I think what's incredible about this day and age is that we have a word for it now, and I've seen that really shift the way that people relate to the topic, right? And so even giving someone a word or having a name to call their experience can create great shifts. And like you were saying before, it doesn't solve the whole situation, but it starts to give us a common language to where we can say, here's what's going on for you, and we want you to be able to talk about this. This is an important part of your experience, and we want to hear about it. And so I think also as therapists, one of the things that I like to always talk about as well is how important it is to give the message that this is okay to bring into therapy, and that this is something that is important and also very relevant to bring into therapy, because I think not everyone feels like they can. So sometimes it's just having an open conversation about even that piece of it that can go a long way.
No, I absolutely agree. And the idea of being able to, if we hang a tag on it, of course, the whole idea of we don't want to stigmatize, we don't want to medicalize, so to speak, but having some shape to contain it, that we're able to then have a conversation about it. Whenever I work with veterans, this is something that I typically do, is we talk about all these different aspects, as you had mentioned. Of course, there was PTSD, and TBI being what everybody really believes is the main thing. But then, of course, as you said, substance abuse, emotion, moral injury, family stuff. And many times I'll ask the veteran, had they heard of moral injury, and they haven't. They said that even those who had been in therapy before had no familiarity with it. So I sort of explain it. And so maybe at this point I'd like to be able to give the audience the actual definition, and this is the definition from yours and your colleagues' article in 2009. Moral injury can be defined as perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held morals, beliefs, and expectations. And so that's I did something, I failed to stop someone else from doing something, I saw it, or I learned about it. And these are things like the Abu Ghraib scandal, or My Lai, of course, back in Vietnam, these large-scale deeply held transgressions. The way I sort of refine it, and definitely correct me if I'm wrong, is just the veterans' definitions about what they consider right and wrong in the world has been shifted by their experiences. Would that be accurate?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, there's this idea about personal expectations and also about shared or cultural expectations as well. And I think it's, something that we talk about a lot too is those things can be the same or they can be different for individuals as well. And so I think just putting that all out on the table can be important for people, because sometimes they cross a personal line, or they feel like they cross a personal line, even though the culture in which they were embedded wouldn't necessarily agree that they crossed that line. So those things can sometimes, I think, also come into conflict and make it hard to sort of digest what it means that they're feeling badly about what happened. So yeah, but I think that definition is important.
And I could see that even shifting, going from a culture where this act is not seen as morally transgressive, and then moving back into a culture where it is seen as morally transgressive. Here we're talking about being in combat and around other individuals who say, well, of course you should have taken the shot, and I would have taken the shot, and you got awarded for taking the shot or praised for taking the shot, but now you come back to the U.S. or a country of civilization, so to speak, and then that's no longer approved. That can be confusing without understanding the cultural nuances back and forth.
Beautifully put. Yes, I agree that the culture plays actually a tremendous role in people coming back and then healing or not being able to heal, right? And I think, I'm glad that you brought that piece up, because I think part of what I'd like to see more of in the future is a discussion about how the culture can help veterans heal from moral injury. So I think it's also, there have been started to be some programs where it's not only on the individual to heal, but that there's a recognition that the culture that we live in has to support veterans. That as a culture, we ask people to go to war, and so we have to have them come back and really understand what we need to do to help veterans heal. And so I've seen programs, and there's starting to be now more programs that are like this, about reading texts together. So civilians and veterans coming together and reading texts, or performances, or, in addition to that, there's sort of more spiritually based community events where people can go and share and have their experiences be witnessed, and in a sort of supportive environment. And so I think that I've seen a number of kind of community interventions as well, and communities coming together to really take the burden off of the veteran and say, what can we do to come together? And it kind of ties into the family piece that you were talking about too, right? Because it's part of this is what us stepping back and saying, what can we do to create an environment to help veterans heal, so that it broadens the scope of what's possible, and broadens the scope of what can be done. So we're thinking about not only traditional ways of healing that we've conceptualized in mental health, but really broadening that to a societal level, so that there can be multiple things that we do as a society to help veterans heal too. So I think that really ties into moral injury, because such a big piece of moral injury is that what people carry with them around not being forgivable, or not being able to be forgiven because of what happened. And so that process of self-forgiveness and for forgiveness of, kind of on a larger scale, I think really does have to involve the community at large as well. So.
I do agree. I think that's critical. As you were talking, I'm thinking back to, we actually had Dr. Philip Smith, one of Joe Courier's colleagues at the University of South Alabama, talking about Operation Deep Dive and how they are looking at community-based interventions around veteran suicide. How can the communities come around and sort of support veterans and curb suicide in an environmental way, in a sort of systematic way around the veteran. But then also, we actually had Brian Dories from the Theater of War Project way back on episode 18, doing exactly that. And what Brian and the taking something that's thousands and thousands of years ago, I mean, going along with Dr. Shea's Achilles in Vietnam, but the plays of Ajax, Sophocles, and talking about Ajax, and being able to present that in such a way that provides distance, but then that gives permission for the community and the veteran to come together to kind of talk about that. So I absolutely agree, and I think that all of these things are necessary. And so a little bit that we're talking about the the moral injury, but you also wanted to discuss a bit some of the interventions that would actually,
Yeah.
we're not just defining the problem, but there's also actual things that the clinical community has found beneficial to sort of help veterans heal from this.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think, two interventions that specifically that we are looking at here. One is an intervention that specifically deals with veterans who have been impacted by killing in war and continue to struggle with that. So that intervention is called the Impact of Killing, or IOK. And that's something that we have kind of developed from the ground up, again, really because of not only my own clinical experiences, but that of my colleagues as well. So I work with a clinician, Chris Berkman here, as well as, a sociologist, Natalie Purcell, who really has been very influential in having us look more at the community aspects of this. But I think really the key is that this IOK grew out of clinical experiences of Chris and I, and also some of my colleagues here. This is kind of an ongoing conversation that we have. And the idea is that we have these evidence-based treatments for PTSD. So I work within a PTSD clinic. And so we have these evidence-based psychotherapies for PTSD. But what we really felt like, even after people do that, if they are suffering from moral injury, often that there's another piece of work that they have to do. And we've just seen that clinically over and over again. And that's really why we developed IOK, to be used if people still, even after getting the evidence-based treatments, continue to have difficulty. And so the idea with IOK is that we really talk about the experiences in great depth, but we also have people do things like think about the topic of self-forgiveness in great depth. And so where we start is we really start with kind of highlighting the kind of the biological and the emotional and the cognitive pieces of what happens in killing in war. And then we move to talking about ways in which people are thinking about their own experiences. And so what we see a lot with killing in war in particular is that people, in addition to guilt and shame, there are a lot of ideas about I don't deserve to be forgiven for what I did. I don't deserve to live a good life, to have a family because of what I did. So there's a lot of ways in which people's functioning can be really halted because of some of the ideas that they have about what they did and what that means about them. There's also this fear that because of what they did, they're concerned about their anger and what that could mean for their relationships and with other people and their families. And so that's all. We kind of disentangle a lot of those thoughts that come up, and we look at those. We unpack all of that and look at it very carefully. We developed a measure called the KCS, or the Killing Cognition Scale, to really capture a lot of those cognitions that we were hearing over and over again in veterans. So the ones that I talked about, just about not deserving to have a family or feeling tremendous guilt or shame. And so really we captured those in a measure, and we kind of give the measure to veterans and say, we want to understand where your moral injury lies. So is it kind of in the functioning piece? Is it in the guilt or the shame? Is it that you're stuck in terms of the spirituality piece? So we really kind of integrate the spirituality piece into that as well. And so we look kind of with a magnifying glass all at the ways that people are thinking about their experiences. And then we also move pretty quickly to talking about self-forgiveness in particular, and having people think about how do they define self-forgiveness and where did they learn about forgiveness and what that means, like from their culture, from their childhood, from the military, and really have them talk in depth about that. And in addition to that, we have them sort of talk about the myths of forgiveness. So to forgive is to forget. I think that's a big one that comes up for people. To forgive is to forget, I think, is one of the biggest reasons that people feel like they don't deserve to forgive themselves, because it would mean forgetting what happened. And so we work with them to really talk about how is it possible to do both, to still remember and commemorate, yet also work towards forgiveness. And that's a critical piece. We also have them write letters in IOK to the people who they have killed in particular. And those letters, as you imagine, can be quite intense and really get at the very core of what people are holding back and holding in. It's all of the worries about, they're talking through a letter to the people who they have killed, and imagine what those people would say back to them too. So it's really, I think, an important piece of healing. And then there's also a very important part of that's not really dealt with in the existing evidence-based treatments is just what we call amends. So that's sort of what are you going to do from here on out to sort of keep healing and to keep this process going. So for a lot of people, it's doing something that will give back to their community, giving back to their families, joining an organization, participating in some of the readings that you and I were talking about today. And so really that amends plan it's not only looking back, but it's also looking forward. And that's kind of a critical piece for us that we talk about. So we come up with a plan of the amends, and we also talk to them also about rituals that might be helpful in healing as well. So for some people, it's really, that can be spiritual rituals. For other people, it can be going back to a particular location, and it can vary dramatically. For some people, it's going for hikes in nature and kind of reconnecting. So that kind of amends and that healing can look, very different for different people. We also have Native American veterans who we've worked with who really have incorporated their own cultural healing rituals into their recovery work as well. So I think that's really, that was very quick, but that's IOK kind of in a nutshell. And I think that's really what we have been working to develop here. And then we also work, there's a trial here for adaptive disclosure, which is kind of dealing with PTSD and loss, and kind of rather than moral injury is one piece of adaptive disclosure, but it's much greater in terms of the scope. So whereas IOK is really focused much more on killing in particular and hones in on that piece of moral injury.
See, and I know that I had actually had the honor of communicating with Dr. Litz when adaptive disclosure, when the protocol first came out, and I've seen that beneficial with a lot of the veterans that I work with regarding that aspect. And I'll definitely make sure for listeners the links to a lot of these different things, but definitely the IOK and then adaptive disclosure we'll have in the show notes. Dr. Maguen, I know that I want to be very, very respectful of your time, and it's been very good. I know that you can talk about this. I absolutely know that I could talk about this for hours and hours. But as we wrap up here, is there anything that you think, any last thoughts or anything that you'd like to address that maybe we didn't talk about?
I think we covered a lot of impressively. I know that you're absolutely right. I think you and I really appreciate the conversation today, and there's so much more to cover, but I think we covered a lot of ground. So I think that we really touched upon a lot of important pieces. I would say that, for me, an important piece is the families. If families are listening and feel like they are recognizing some of these aspects of moral injury, I would just, again, encourage people to reach out. I think I can't stress enough, and I know this is kind of a common theme for your show, but I think a lot of times it's families urging veterans to get connected or to get help that really makes all of the difference in that trajectory, whether that be connecting with mental health or whether that be connecting with larger communities. But I think that I can't stress enough how important families are in just even giving a name to moral injury if that's what they're seeing their loved ones experience. So I think that's probably a good note to end on. And it's just really been a pleasure. So I thank you for having me on and taking the time. And I hope that if anyone wants more information or I can be helpful, I'm definitely available through email and very happy to field any questions as well if other people have questions who are listening in.
Sure. So do you want to go ahead and provide them that email in case they're listening? We'll make sure that's in the show notes as well.
Absolutely. So it's Shira Maguen at va.gov. So my first name, my last name at va.gov. And please feel free to be in contact if I can be of help or if any questions come up.
And of course, for those listening, don't hesitate, because that's exactly what I did, was just reach out, cold email, I think, and Dr. Maguen is very gracious in responding and obviously giving us her time here. So thank you again for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV podcast network. I'm sincerely appreciative of Dr. Maguen's willingness to have the conversation about moral injury. The idea that it's similar to but different from post-traumatic stress is an important one. If you're a longtime listener to the show, you'll know that we talked about the interconnectedness of these concepts in the Veteran Mental Health Bootcamp, where we gave you an introduction to moral injury. Moral injury is one aspect of mental health that sort of sets veterans apart. We often have these conversations about PTSD. Combat's not the only way that one can get PTSD, and you don't have to have served in the military. Moral injury does complicate things, and it can complicate things for those who never served as well. A vehicle accident, for example, if one was at fault, could be traumatic enough to cause PTSD, but also have the guilt and shame associated with moral injury. Moral injury related to combat or military service in general, however, is something different. You often hear about the bonds that are created among those served, and the loss of someone you served with is significant. Dr. Maguen also talked about the moral implications of killing and how some can experience guilt and shame around it. Another interesting fact, one that I hadn't considered, is when our individual beliefs about right and wrong conflict with cultural expectations. In his book, The Lucifer Effect, Philip Zimbardo says there are situational and systematic factors that influence our behavior. Zimbardo is most famous for the Stanford prison experiment, in which a group of college kids were separated into guards and prisoners. The guards became more sadistic, and the prisoners became more passive, based on their roles and the expectations of the environment and the experiment. When one's in an environment that celebrates aggression, anger, and violence, and our personal thoughts about what's right and wrong don't fit in with that, then there's conflict. If we do engage in aggression and violence, contrary to what we originally thought was quote-unquote right, and then come back to a culture that does not celebrate aggression, anger, and violence in the same way, then we feel like we don't quite fit in. An additional note from Zimbardo: attempting to understand the situational and systematic contributions to any individual's behavior does not excuse the person or absolve him or her from the responsibility in engaging in immoral, illegal, or evil deeds. Just because we want to understand the environment of the Abu Ghraib prison does not mean that the people who took part in the scandals there are justified in their actions as a result of the influence. Another important point that Dr. Maguen brought up was how to overcome moral injury and how it goes beyond forgiveness. She talked about the difference between forgiveness and forgetting. Many veterans that I work with say they can't forgive themselves because if they do, then they may feel like they forget what they did. If they forget what they did, it means what they did was meaningless, and the veteran knows that it's not. Experiencing forgiveness but not forgetting is possible, and it's one path to healing. Atonement, as Dr. Maguen said, is another important one. Often, when someone's opinion of what's right and wrong is changed by their military experience, they feel like there's nothing that can be done to make up for their actions. Atonement, making amends for past mistakes, can do much to repair the injury of the heart and soul that comes with moral injury. There are a lot of great opportunities to engage in that kind of atonement. Team Rubicon, The Mission Continues, the Travis Manion Foundation. Each of these organizations aim to support veterans in finding meaning and purpose in their post-military lives and can be vehicles for personal atonement and making amends. Thanks again for taking the time to listen to this conversation. You can find the show notes for this episode and all of the episodes at veteranmentalhealth.com. You can also find more about moral injury in my book, Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy, which can be found at veteranmentalhealth.com/combat vet book. You can find it on Amazon as well. Make sure to join us next week when we talk to another combat veteran, Christopher Milaro. After his military service, Chris started a company called NeuroFlow, which supports veterans and mental health providers through the use of technology. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it, and until then, stay focused and be well. I'd like to thank the Change Your POV Podcast Network for hosting this show and highlighting the critical importance of veteran mental health. We want to hear from you. You can reach out to me via email at dwayne@veteranmentalhealth.com. You can find me at Twitter at @TheCounselingVet, or head on over to Facebook and look for the Change Your POV Squad. You can find the show notes for this episode and all the episodes by going to veteranmentalhealth.com or changeyourpov.com. Sign up for updates on either or both so you don't miss another episode. While you're at it, check out the other great shows on the Change Your POV Podcast Network. The show about remembering our military history and reviving our warrior spirit, Changing Hearts and Minds. The show about outdoor activities that us veterans love so much, Neophyte in the Woods. The show that helps us get going at the beginning of the week, Motivation Monday, and Attack Fridays, the show that brings you actionable tips, tricks, and coachable knowledge to help you make the best of your transition. While you're checking out the other shows, drop us a review in iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're listening to. The reviews really help spread the word about what we're doing. If you're looking for the total package for all the information you need to live the life you want after leaving the military, you found it. If you know of a buddy who's looking for the same info, share it with them so they can find it too. I want to thank Doc Todd for his permission to use his track, Not Alone, from his amazing album, Combat Medicine. Doc Todd is somebody who's trying to bring veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can get the album by going to therealdoctodd.com. Check it out, because remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created mini-me's. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I heard each time I wake, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. You're not alone.
Yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I heard each time I wake, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
Yeah. And every time that I fall,
Come
I'ma
on.
call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.